Hi everyone, welcome back to the course on Sociology of Media and Communication. So, today we are going to be starting with our second lecture, and this is in continuation of the unit 1, which is Introduction to Media and Communication. So, in the previous lecture I had outlined a basic understanding of what communication is and how it is different from media, but an integral part of media nonetheless. So, in that lecture I had mentioned that the rise of the public sphere is a very significant point in the history of communication. So, this concept of the public sphere and its usage in terms of how it explains to us the relationship between media and communication is very crucial to understanding communication, particularly in democracies and recent societies. Now, this idea of the public sphere actually stems back to German philosopher Habermas, who unfortunately passed away recently, who had coined this term to talk about primarily modern European democratic societies in which political participation is enacted through the medium of talk or communication. It is a space in which citizens deliberate about their common affairs, hence an institutionalized arena for discursive interaction. This arena is conceptually distinct from the state, and it is a site for the production and circulation of discourses that can in principle be critical of the state. So, what I mean is that it is a space for public discussion and it is separate from the state and the market. The public sphere, according to Habermas, is supposed to be a critical site of intervention in which it is also primarily generating a lot of communication. The public sphere in the Habermasian sense is also distinct from the market. It is not an arena of market relations, but rather one of discursive relations, an arena for debating and deliberating rather than for buying and selling. This concept of the public sphere permits us to keep in view the distinction between the state apparatuses, economic markets and democratic associations. So, the Habermasian idea of the public sphere has been indispensable to critical social theory and democratic political practice. A lot of people have gone on to critique Habermas, develop his ideas further, but this has been a very important concept which has also been crucial to how we think about the media. Now, this idea of the public sphere, if we have to sort of think about in, let us say, keywords sense, can be thought of in ways where Habermas is talking about a particular European society which is also democratic in nature and post-feudal. So, this is the era which is after the feudal era, and he sees a space for democratic participation. So, the key features are that it has open access, which is an ideal feature. Ideal feature meaning that it may not be true at all times, but this is what ideally is believed to be. The public sphere is also a space for rational critical debate. So, it is not in that sense connected to what the state considers to be the public sphere, but it is an alternative to the state. It is separate from the state. The public sphere allows for the formation of the public opinion. So, he sees certain public spaces like cafes, salons, reading parlors, libraries, etc. in the West as central to how the public sphere grows in these particular spaces. So, what he envisages is that people get together in these spaces and they talk to each other, rationally, critically debate and deliberate, and that is how the idea of the public sphere evolves. Now, interestingly, when we are thinking about the public sphere from the Habermasian sense, it has a very Western kind of tradition. So, the historical emergence, as I have already stated, has been in 18th century Europe, and it is very crucially connected to the growth of the printing press and print media. So, in the previous lecture I had mentioned that when we think about the printing press and the printing media, we also think about how it led to mass industrial production and reception of news. Now, Habermas suggests that the newspaper primarily plays a huge role in the facilitation of this creation of the public sphere. So, he suggests that when we have movement of merchants and traders across the world, they are carrying with them a sense of the news and the newspaper to different parts of the world, thereby facilitating discussions and debates on particular issues. For instance, if one sees the later 19th century and early 20th century, one could see the rise of anti-colonial movements, and this is a very global phenomena cutting across countries, continents. And in that time, there was no social media or digital media where you could receive information instantly. However, what was there was this flow and connections through particular ways in which that information was carried forward. Now, what are the functions of the public sphere? So, one is that it mediates between the state and society. So, primarily existing as a space which is separate from the state as well as the larger society and acting as an arena of critical debate, it envisage that kind of facilitation between what the state sort of wanted to impose or rather have, and then what the larger society thought. Secondly, it ensured accountability of the democratically elected state to fulfill its purpose and functions, because there were people and members of the society who were sort of engaging in these public debates. The other function of the public sphere is also that it generated consensus amongst primarily what would be the population while pitching an idea to the government. Interestingly, the critique of Habermas by people like Nancy Fraser and subsequently many others have been built on the idea of the public sphere, which they suggest in the Habermasian sense is a bourgeois public sphere. So, what does this mean? Primarily, as you can see on your screen, it means that it was dominated by elites and it was exclusionary in practice. Let us first take a detour into the origin of this term, the bourgeois. So, many of you who may or may not be familiar with Karl Marx know that he talked about two primary classes, the bourgeois and the proletariat. The bourgeois are the upper classes, the ones who possess the means of production, which means that they are also the haves because they possess the means of production, whereas the proletariat are actually the have-nots. Primarily how the idea of the proletariat is constructed is that they do not have means of production. So, this public sphere that Habermas talks about in 18th century Europe is also seen as a very bourgeois understanding, where the people who he thinks are part of the public sphere and have a role in shaping public opinion are elite. They come from a particular class and national background. So, he is talking about a very white upper class male dominated public sphere. So, automatically it becomes exclusionary by practice. Now, interestingly, the decline of this public sphere is also explained by Habermas, who connects it to the rise of mass media and a shift to manipulated opinion. What Habermas means by this is that the rational critical nature of the public sphere, which is so critical to him as a characteristic of what he would envisage to be the public, declines with the rise of mass media. So, what this means is that when there is entry of corporate and commercial media, there is an entry of the criticality in debate. Now, Habermas's book, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, talks about this at length. Let's understand this idea of the public sphere more engagingly with the use of some examples. Now, what he suggests is that once, let us say, there is entry of mass media, which is thriving on what would be the industrialization of media, and entry of more technological forces which can take content and information outside the rational critical debates, he sees it as an erasure or a decline of the true nature of the public sphere. So, for him, when people are talking in private and debating about political matters, that does not form a part of the public sphere. A public sphere is formed only when those opinions and discussions happen in the true public sense. Now, the Habermasian idea of the public sphere, as has been suggested, is rooted in his own understanding of how he would see the public to be. So, let us also discuss a little bit about the critique of the public sphere and why has Habermas been critiqued. So, one of his foremost critiques is Nancy Fraser, who primarily argued that the object of inquiry that Habermas has of the rise and decline of a historically specific and limited form of the public sphere should be actually called the liberal model of the bourgeois public sphere. So, Fraser argues that the public sphere that Habermas talks about is a liberal model of the bourgeois public sphere, and she, on the other hand, says that Habermas stops short of developing a new post-bourgeois model of the public sphere, where he does not really talk about the public in a more diverse sense. He ignores the class inequality, the racial inequality, the ethnic inequality that exist when he is thinking about the public sphere. He is also, according to Fraser and several other critiques, drawing on false universality, where he is looking at the public sphere as something which breeds a universal rational critical opinion. Now, interestingly, when we are thinking about the public sphere and its critique, there is another sense of a critique that emerges in terms of what is rooted in exclusions from this public sphere. So, who are the people who are excluded? Fraser argues that women, lower classes, minorities, they are excluded from what would be called the public sphere, primarily owing to the nature in ways in which Habermas describes it. So, she suggests an alternative term which she calls the counterpublics to talk about the public sphere. What is this counterpublic now? The counterpublic actually, according to Fraser, is an alternative public which primarily means that it is a different sort of public from the one that Habermas envisaged. Now, this idea of the alternative public or the counterpublic has been found in several societies which have also been critical of the Habermasian sense of the public sphere. The counterpublic, according to Fraser and others, is primarily the voice of the marginalized, where the people who are historically excluded from the way that he envisages the liberal bourgeois public sphere, their voices are taken into account. Let us take an example from the Indian context. So, for instance, if we think about the Indian context, when we go back to the era that Habermas is writing about and the post and pre-independence era, India had a very vibrant public sphere. But this public sphere, unlike what Habermas suggests, was not universal in the Indian context. So, several scholars who have worked on civil society and public sphere in India, including Amir Ali and Rajiv Bhargava, they talk about the public sphere as diverse. This diversity of the public sphere is rooted in how the public sphere was not, the same. For instance, if one looks at the print material from this particular era in the Indian context, you will find that while the British were more or less successful in censoring English newspapers and English content, it was very difficult for them to censor vernacular languages. reason being that India's public sphere, driven by the vernacular press and resistance which was also depicted in the vernacular press, was very diverse and very regional also. So, almost every part of the country had its own counterpublic, had its own resistance, critical debate. So, when we are thinking about the Indian context in the era that Habermas is writing about Western Europe, one can actually see counterpublic being a more useful concept to think about Indian society, because first of all we do not have a unified public sphere, but we had multiple publics and multiple alternative counterpublics. Even when we think about the national movement, which was one of the key sort of resistance to British rule, colonial rule in that period, one could see that even within the nationalist movement, there were different kinds of publics which played a role in how they thought about the nationalist imagination. For instance, what was happening in Bengal would be very different from what was happening in down south or in central India. These are all diverse publics and they represent ideas of resistance, alternative discourse as well as questions of identity. So, the counterpublics in fact play a very crucial role in how one's identity is reflected. So, some of the more interesting works in recent years on hip hop music, for instance, looks at how hip hop is used as an assertion of their identity by particular communities who have been marginalized. For instance, African American communities in the West, they use hip hop as a counter to sort of resist the idea of cultural dominance and hegemony that is imposed on them, and how they think about questions of their own identity and resistance. So, this idea of the counterpublic that Fraser develops and others also build on sort of critique the Habermasian idea of how he understands communication, and of course, through this way of looking at the idea of communication as from a top to bottom approach. Some of the examples of the counterpublic in the Indian context could be women's groups, Dalit publics and minority media. So, for instance, the women's rights movement has played a very active role in lobbying for rights when it comes to asserting their fundamental issues, as well as acting as a mediating public along with the state and society, as well as when it comes to the law. For instance, in the post-independence era, if one thinks about the women's rights movement and the several women's groups that have existed in the Indian context, you will see that they have actively lobbied with the Indian state, as well as filed legal cases and taken legal help to primarily grant women rights in multiple cases. The Mathura rape case, for instance, or what happened in the anti-dowry agitations in Delhi are reflections of how women's groups have used the public sphere as a mediating space, but they would not be a public sphere in the way that Habermas had imagined it. Instead, it is a counterpublic as Fraser would sort of understand, primarily because it is an alternative sphere. Similarly, Dalit publics in the Indian context are also very interesting to understand, particularly when we go back to the nationalist movement and the role of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar in Indian constitutional politics, as well as the emergence of several caste groups through history and the kind of negotiations they made with the Indian National Congress, as well as other dominant parties and stakeholders, and later on with the Indian state. So, they too will not be a conventional public sphere as Habermas would understand. Similarly, when we think about minority media platforms, these over the years in most historical contexts exist in spite of state suppression and censorship, be it in dictatorial countries or in democratic countries where media could be suppressed and censored. You find the existence of alternative media platforms. They continue to remain as counterpublics and very much part of the public. Now, why do these counterpublics matter? They matter because they bring about a parity in participation and increase the democratic nature and access of how we think about the public sphere. So, one of the major critiques of Habermas was that his idea of the public sphere was exclusionary. So, this idea of how we think about the counterpublic differently talk about democratic inclusion. So, the women's groups that I just underlined, they would not be a part of how Habermas understands the public sphere, but that does not mean that they do not exist. They exist and they are very much a part of how civil society in India is governed. So, the way in which we envisage and understand them through this concept of the alternative public makes it important to also understand their socio-political role. So, when we are thinking about, let us say, comparing between the public and the counterpublic, the idea of consensus and contestation are very important. So, in the public sphere that Habermas talks about, consensus is the key in the idea of the public, that they have consensus. You have uniformity, you have universality. So, it can be a public sphere only when there is that kind of consensus between members. Whereas, Fraser and others they go on to show that contestation is also equally important when we think about the public sphere. What it means is that contestation is not necessarily a bad characteristic, but that it increases the diversity and the varied nature of the public sphere. So, on the one hand, while one model of the liberal bourgeois public sphere emphasizes on consensus, the other is also based on contestation, dissent. So, in stratified societies, it is very difficult to have a unified single public. We require multiple publics and they also coexist. What the multiple publics do is actually enhance communication. So, when there are multiple public spheres or alternative publics, they bring in different viewpoints of communication, and therefore, the way that we understand media and the reflections of communication in them are enhanced. So, in the Indian context, again when we go back to questions of caste and power, they shape communication. So, it becomes very important to think about the public sphere also from these ideas of the social, that who get to be a part of the public sphere. So, the counterpublics in India, as I have already outlined, consist of diverse regional voices, and when we discuss newspapers, when we discuss television, when we discuss digital media, you will see how these diverse regional voices particularly bring in a variety of opinions and also different kind of points when we think about information or communication. The digital space today in fact offers a rich understanding of how the counterpublics work. The role of the media, as we have been discussing, is very crucial in this, as it plays a very significant role in shaping the discourse, which means that the media that we have is also a reflection of the way that the public itself is constructed. What it means is that when we compare how maybe Indian news is covered in the Western media versus Indian news channels, one would see how the discourse is reflection of how the media itself is socially embedded. So, the media as an institution, as you will see through this course, is also a social institution. It is embedded in the social cultural politics. So, the global kind of reflection of the public sphere is reflection of that media, whereas the Indian media reflection would be a reflection of how our ecosystems are constructed. So, the key takeaways from this particular sort of lecture is to think about the public sphere actually is the ideal type. The ideal type is the one which one desires that it exists, whereas the counterpublics are actually necessary and also the reality. what this means is that it is not possible to have a unified public sphere, but what instead is necessary is that the multiple publics, which are these alternative publics, are recognized. Their voices are considered as crucial when we are forming ideas of communication. So, media today is at a crossroad where, while there is increasing corporatization and homogenization, as Habermas would argue, but at the same time there is also the existence of multiple forms of alternatives from which we could sort of also get diverse viewpoints. Now, there are two discussion points which I want all of you to focus and think about when you are thinking about the public sphere, that how is the social media positioned as a public sphere and are counterpublics effective. So, when we are thinking about the relationship between media and communication, can we think about the social media as a public sphere, or is it also divided into separate publics? Secondly, are counterpublics effective when we are thinking about media and communication? So, think a little bit about these kinds of concepts when we are dealing with what we would be calling this relationship between media and communication. So, we are going to wind up this lecture with these discussion points, and we will come back in the next lecture. Thank you.